This is the HIPAA training I've been informing you guys about. As you recall, about February, March of this year, we were the subject of a HIPAA compliance review, which prompted us to where we are today. Our HIPAA policy has been revised, a HIPAA appendix has been created, and there have been a number of revisions, additions to the pre-existing policy. So Amy Mace and Andrea Nodolf from the city's legal team are here to present the revised policy to us today. Andrea, probably to her dislike, has become the local HIPAA expert. There is no such thing as a HIPAA expert, I would say, probably in the state. And Andrea spent a ton of time in this and helped us out immensely. So to prevent any further HIPAA compliance issues, we are taping this presentation today. It'll be reviewed by everyone within the department, and there will be a written test when everything is done. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Amy and Andrea.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry to keep you waiting. I know we were supposed to start a few minutes ago, so thank you for your patience. Andre and I will be going over the HIPAA policy, kind of alerting you to what has changed, and then talking about some, what you may run into on the job. We want this process to be informative, so we encourage you to ask questions because you know the type of questions that come up in the field better than Andre and I do. Just to let you know, HIPAA, you unfortunately are one of the few city departments who have to worry about this law. It is a very complicated, long law, which you'll see by your policy, which is also quite long. Fortunately for you, there are things in the policy that don't come up on a day-to-day basis that really you'll only have to worry about, and probably at a supervisory level, if you get a request, for instance, of an accounting of disclosures, which we'll talk about later very briefly, just so you know what that is. But that's something that more the supervisory level will have to worry about, and so we're not going to spend a lot of time going into very detailed accounts regarding some of those requirements, but we do want you to know what's in the policy and so that you have a working knowledge of what it involves. There will be a short test at the end, just to test your knowledge of what we've covered today, and also provides more of an opportunity to go through and talk about, just what we've learned and answer questions if you have any questions. So like I said, I encourage you to ask questions throughout. Just stop us as we're talking. So what is HIPAA anyway? It stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and its primary focus is focused on securing private patient health information and the privacy of personally identifiable health care information. It applies to healthcare providers, which of course includes physicians and sort of the common people you'd think of associated with hospitals, but it also does include ambulance services. From your standpoint, your main concerns in regards to HIPAA is protecting patient privacy when you're dealing with patients, ensuring that if someone is inquiring about personal health information that they have the right to receive that information, and then safeguarding patient information. So taking precautions to ensure that documents you're creating or when you're working on your computer, when you leave, that you're safeguarding and protecting that privacy. And Andrea is going to talk, when she talks about sort of the practical workday situations, what to do to ensure that patient information is safeguarded. So the first area we're going to talk about is the protecting patient privacy. So what is PHI? You'll see throughout the policy, and when we talk about it, we'll probably refer to that abbreviation rather than saying protected health information. But that's what PHI is protected health information. It's defined as individually identifiable patient health information, and it would include, for instance, demographic information, addresses, birth, private information that you've gathered in regard to the patient that includes their demographics. It deals with their past, their present, or their future physical or mental health care, and also payment information. It's created by or received by a healthcare provider, so it's information you create as well as information you may have collected from an outside healthcare provider. It includes oral, written, photographic, electronic, and digital information. So the main obligations for the Red Wing Fire and Ambulance in regard to privacy rights is that HIPAA prohibits the release of any PHI to anyone outside the organization unless it's required for purposes of treatment, payment, or healthcare operations, or specifically authorized by the law. So for instance, this would come up in terms of when you're transporting someone to the hospital and you need to provide PHI to the hospital attendant who meets the ambulance. That's covered under HIPAA. You can release it to them because it's required for purposes of treatment. Now you'll notice that this talks about anyone outside the organization. The test for inside your organization, so within the department, is does the person, your coworker, need the information in order to perform their duties? So if your coworker, in order to perform their duties, needs private health information on a patient, then you can release it to that coworker. Now, if that person doesn't need to know, who the name of the patient or details about it, but you want to talk to your coworkers about a situation that happened, or perhaps you're going to use the information for training purposes, then you want to take out information that would identify who the patient is. So each time when you're thinking about, talking about a situation, the thought that needs to run through your head is, does this coworker need the information in order to do their job? Tom and I have talked about some situations that come up, as I understand it, is that you have patients who are recurring patients. They're not, you know that you're probably going to be dealing with that patient again. And so if there's something particular to that patient that, another paramedic should know in case they run into that patient, then that is a need-to-know basis. You have a need to know that information in order to properly care for that person if you run into that person again. So, part of it's common sense, and part of it is just always, thinking about that sort of test in your mind. One other HIPAA requirement is this minimum necessary standard. And what HIPAA provides is that you have to use the minimum amount of PHI necessary to accomplish the task. And what that means is that you would not disclose or use or request an entire medical record unless you really needed the entire record to do the job. Now, this minimum necessary idea does not apply to requests by a healthcare provider for treatment purposes. So if you got a request from a hospital for all treatment related documents because they're having an ongoing treatment relationship with that patient, you don't have to worry about this, oh, do they need everything or can I just ship it all over? The minimum necessary doesn't apply in that type of situation. It also doesn't apply when you're talking to the patient themselves or disclosures made to the patient. They have the right to get everything. And then there's a couple other, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services and when it's required by law. But so that's another sort of standard to think about if you're receiving a request from someone outside.
Okay, and I'm going to talk about the three basic uses of using PHI. And those three uses are treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. And Minnesota law is actually more restrictive than HIPAA is. And so you're required by Minnesota law to obtain written consent to disclose medical records outside of Red Wing Fire and Ambulance for treatment, payment, and generally healthcare operations. Treatment, you may freely share PHI with other healthcare providers who need that information in order to treat the patient. You arrive at the hospital, you tell the nurse, the doctors, anything important that happened over the ride, any allergies, anything involving the patient's treatment, freely disclose. You do not need to apply the minimum necessary rule that Amy was talking about. So here it's just informing healthcare providers, anything relevant to the patient. The second area is payment, and Minnesota law requires written consent to disclose information outside of Red Wing Fire and Ambulance for payment, treatment, and healthcare operations. And generally, for payment purposes, it's just the name of the patient, the date of their service, symptoms, diagnosis, and the name of the patient. And generally, most of you will not be involved in payment operations, but it is important to obtain written signature of patients in this patient care report, which is on your tablet when you go over payment with the patient. So it's important to obtain that written signature, but if you don't, Expert T billing is your billing company. They will go back and obtain that written authorization from the patient. But if you can get it while you're in the ambulance with the patient, that helps everyone out.
One of the things I could add to that, I spoke with Expert T yesterday on this matter, and they can go back and get the signature. They have a signature form that they send out to patients if we don't get a signature in the field. For Medicare, Medicaid patients, it's relatively, it's kind of a seamless transition. The patients that become the most difficult are the patients that do have insurance. Ultimately, those people can disregard the letter they've gotten from Expert T, pretend they didn't get it, not provide the signature, and we can't legally send them the bill. So it's the kind of under 65 crowd that this becomes incredibly important on, that we get those signatures in the field. The less work Expert T has to do to collect the data, the better our rates stay as far as our billing with Expert T, the more timely we get paid. Even for someone that does comply with the signature, they can postpone it and take a month or two to provide the signature so that we can bill them. By getting the signature in the field, we get the bills processed more quickly, our rates with Expert T stay lower, it's just a more efficient operation. So by all means, unless the patient is unable to sign, make every effort to get the signature in the field.
So if they don't sign, so at your rate, we don't get paid, then we can't bill them directly?
My understanding of Minnesota law, and from what I heard from Expert T yesterday, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that we cannot legally send a bill without the patient's signature.
To the insurance company, but
To
you're
the-
talking about, you
to the-
certainly could bill the person directly.
Individually, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and go through that collections process, obviously
Yeah,
it's.
because it was a service provided, whether they want to send it to them.
The other interesting twist is for Medicare, Medicaid patients, as well as the insured group, how did this work? If the signature comes on the follow-up form that Expert T sends out, then Expert T, the money that the individual would receive from their insurance company goes directly to the individual and not to Red Wing Fire and Ambulance directly. So if we don't get the signature in the field, there's an avenue that allows the insurance company to compensate the patient directly versus compensating us directly. So the direct compensation is by far where you want to go.
The third permitted use for disclosing PHI is for healthcare operations, and that refers to training activities if the department decided to do an internal audit to improve operations. And the minimum necessary rule applies here, and in the policy there's this long de-identification of PHI piece, which really would not apply to the vast majority of you, but let's say we were to do a training, we would remove all identifiers, the name, address, anything that can identify the patient to conduct the training. And okay, so now we're going to talk about the typical ambulance call. And I've never been involved with ambulance calls or EMT, so if you have any questions, feel free to jump in. The first question is dispatch and response. Can you share PHI over the radio with other responding agencies? Yes, of course you can, for treatment-related purposes. So if you're on the way to the hospital, HIPAA does not prohibit you from calling the hospital, describing the patient's current condition, any relevant information that they may have.
Can you name as well? You can release the name?
Yes.
Over the radio to
Yep. Yep. Okay, the second question is, can the dispatch center transmit PHI over the radio? Yes, again, they need to let you know the patient's name, address, so you can get there, and if they have questions, feel free to answer. You're talking to people who are related to the treatment of the patient and freely discuss PHI with those individuals.
Does this assume that the radio is blocked? I mean, the frequency.
Secure channels?
Yes, yes.
Well, I don't think there are no channels. There's
No, not on the.
Well,
We learned that.
I was going to back up to that one, because that is a point of confusion, not confusion, a different understanding than what we have is,
Okay.
because of scanners, in the old
Oh.
VHF radio world, because of scanners, we were always of the understanding that names could not be given. I mean, you could provide the patient condition, but no address, for example, or no name.
When you're talking, just to clarify, Tom, when you're talking to the hospital,
The receiving
you're
hospital.
going to?
Now and I'm asking, I don't know.
Yeah.
With the new radio, 800 megahertz radio system that's out there, I don't know if their pagers, scanners exist yet, but they, with all certainty, if they don't, they will. They do.
I guess to that extent, if you didn't need to name the person, I wouldn't. Just, because it's a conservative approach and won't get you into trouble. However, I think you would be covered if you had to, because HIPAA does say you can release private health information to for treatment purposes. And certainly that is why you're releasing it. So I think you would have an argument that you're covered, but, why not name the person if you don't
You
have
have
to?
to.
But it doesn't say anything about secure channels
No.
It doesn't get into that detail in HIPAA.
No.
So what they normally ask you, the hospital wants their initials and date of birth, is typically what
Okay.
they'll ask for.
Yeah, so I think that makes sense. Why?
So that's fine.
They probably don't need to know the name unless there was, again, maybe it's some repeat person or something that they need to know, and maybe you can share that information in a different form too.
They seem to be able to, just off the initials and date of birth, get their information ready, but that's usually what they ask for. So we've always been confused about that.
So as a recommendation, unless it's absolutely necessary, we wouldn't give the name?
Yeah, I think I would continue to follow the practice you've been following.
Okay.
And I do think, you're not going to get in trouble then. Someone's not going to claim, oh, you violated my HIPAA rights because you gave my name. Like I said, I think you'd have a defense if someone made that argument, but why not just take the safe route and hopefully you never get to that point?
You may not want to expose yourself to that.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, you arrive on scene. What about talking to the media or bystanders? In the appendix, we have information for media templates, and I believe that's the supervisors, captains are completing those out. But let's say if you were approached by a local media asking for information about the patient, how would you respond?
Talk to him.
That's a good.
I just tell them
Okay.
that I can't answer you.
That's a very good idea to do. Just refer it to your supervisor. And talking to bystanders, if Joe Smo, the neighbor, comes across the street wanting to know what's going on, he's not involved in the treatment or doesn't really have a need to know. So just inform them that you cannot share that information. And but of course, you can talk to other witnesses who are there, family members who may have a reason to share allergy information or history. So any questions?
One of the things that I found helpful when people ask is if I explain that I can't legally provide that information, they take that better than I just can't tell you. And it helps them understand the process. So.
Exactly. We always advise clients, you can blame the law for the reasons you can't provide information to people.
And we're going to discuss information for law enforcement later. So what about after the call? Can you discuss health information with your coworkers? Was there a typical practice? You come back and say, had a really exciting pickup, crazy accident, I needed to pull someone out of a car.
Reveal names, I think.
Yes, and it is. HIPAA doesn't prohibit you from sharing information about how you extracted someone from a car or helpful information with your coworkers, but you do want to remove identifying information. But let's say 2 ambulances show up on the scene, you can definitely share with your coworkers information about you can share PHI about a victim's health and treatment related purposes. But after the call, you're here at the station talking about your day. Remove identifying information. And that goes with friends and family too. You can share you had a rough day or exciting day, but don't be saying address or name or anything that can identify a patient. Yep.
Does that kind of fall along the lines of what you talked about as far as within the organization? If it's pertinent as far as you might, if you get called back to this person, you might need to look for this as far as like something important they need to know for future operations. But is that kind of along the same lines?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, now can you share information with law enforcement? HIPAA places limitations on what Red Wing Fire and Ambulance can release, but because the police department is not a covered entity under the health law, they don't have the restrictions that you all have. So it's important to know like the certain circumstances when you are permitted to release PHI. And you may release PHI to law enforcement to help identify or locate a suspect, fugitive, material witness, or missing person, provided that limited information is disclosed. So in that instance, just share what you need to share in order to get the job done. You don't need to elaborate on by sharing more PHI. You can also release PHI to law enforcement when an individual has died and you have a suspicion that the death may have resulted from criminal conduct. And the third situation is if you believe that PHI constitutes evidence of criminal conduct that occurred on the premises here, which is unlikely.
On those regards, if a patient tells us that they have been taking cocaine or something like that and they had more with them, is that something that we can release to the police officers so that the drugs or weapons that they might have can be taken away by the police?
Also, I have another one about reporting abuse and neglect of a patient.
Yeah,
Are we allowed to release the information to law enforcement then?
Yep, you may also release it to alert the police department of the commission and nature of a crime, the location of such crime, and the identity, description, and location of the perpetrator of such crime. So that your question would fall under this exception that you would be able to,
Anything related to a crime.
exactly. Or you need to, someone so ran off or anything to identify a suspect is permitted. You may also release PHI to comply with a court order, grand jury subpoena, or administrative request. I'm going to go back to the previous slide. You can always release PHI if the suspect or victim of a crime agrees to the disclosure. And then also, if you were, this is a very limited circumstance, but if you're unable to obtain the individual's agreement because of an emergency or incapacity, it can only be released when the police department informs you that information is needed to determine whether a violation of law by a person other than the victim has occurred, and such information is not intended to be used against the victim. The police department represents that immediate action is necessary, and waiting until you can obtain the consent of the individual would be materially adverse to their investigation. And the disclosure is in the best interests of the individual. So that one's going to be sort of rare, but as your questions were, it's usually you arrive on scene and you notice information that's pertinent to identifying a victim or pertinent to a crime.
And just to clarify, these exceptions are listed in the appendix, correct, of the HIPAA policy?
They're in the policy too, but
Oh, they are, okay.
it's an abbreviated version in the policy and then very extensive in the appendix. Yep.
It seems like most of the exceptions as far as releasing information to law enforcement have to do with, their operations. If there's any kind of crime or a threat or this and that, is there anything that really stands out as far as EMS can't release to law enforcement? Is there any thing that seems to be an issue as far as that goes? Because it seems like most things related to law enforcement issues we can release.
But if they have drugs on them, that's not,
Yeah, like what Brian was saying, that's not really a crime.
it's not a crime. So can we tell the
I think it would be
officers?
It's against the law.
It's against the law, but it's when they're talking to nature.
But it's something that the police don't know about.
And it's a may release piece too, it's not a mandatory release, the crime piece of it. The issue that would come up is if it's probably more so if it's not associated with a crime. So, if you happen to respond to an accident, but, there's no indication that it's a crime type of thing, and they're asking for information. That might be a situation where you have to think about.
Okay. So if we get a call from the state patrol, can you tell us who's on that accident? We can't really give that information, is that correct? Or?
So say that, so Ben, they just want to know who.
Yeah, say we went to an accident and they, for whatever reason, the troopers didn't get that information.
in regards to the patient?
Yeah, yeah. Because they'll make their own report, you know.
Right.
I wouldn't, the name of the patient, I'd be reluctant to release. I would say maybe I pick them up at so-and-so location, or, because in that circumstance, you don't know if it's really related to a crime or identifying a suspect. They just,
But if, say, the state patrol are involved, they're part of that scheme, and sometimes we leave before they get their information, so can we release that? Had a car accident, say we go to a multi-car accident, and you know, they didn't get the information because they're doing traffic control or whatever, investigating the scene, they didn't get the patients that we hauled up, so now can they get them from us or not?
Doesn't constitute a continuation of care.
Well,
It
no,
does
but-
or doesn't?
It doesn't, it has nothing to do with
But it
patient
has to
care.
do with the police officer.
But if they're on scene, because you're on scene with an accident with the state patrol, they'll get the patient's information right there. I mean, they'll take their ID or
If they
whatever.
have time.
Yeah, if they have time. So, I mean, is that, I mean, it seems kind of odd, like, I mean, you know, trooper will take their ID and get information down. I mean, we don't prevent them from doing that.
No.
So how is that any different if they call for that information later? I guess
That's
is what I'm asking.
Theoretically, it's probably not any different, but operationally, because we provide the information after the fact, I can see
Right.
where it would be the concern.
Right.
So
Yeah, because I just don't see how it falls within one of the exceptions. Unless
basically, we
they're
get that call,
telling,
just.
unless
I
they're
would-
telling you that it's.
I would guess, I would, law enforcement has got other avenues to obtain that individual's identification. It's kind of like the reporter, and this is, I'm just thinking out loud.
Right.
It's kind of like the reporter wanting the name of a patient in a car accident. Well, we can't provide that, but if the reporter does the legwork and goes to the police report and gets the name, he can put the two together and write the story any way he wants. But we haven't provided that information. I would think that law enforcement, after the fact, would have to do their own legwork, not involving us, because it's protected information for us, even if it isn't for them.
Correct. And that's my, I'll look at the exceptions as we continue on and see if I see anything. But, when we looked at the exceptions, there was the one about, locating a suspect, fugitive, material witness, missing person. So if for some reason they gave you information that applied. But there's nothing that just sort of says to identify who was involved in an accident.
right.
But you're right, it doesn't, operational wise, it seems like it doesn't make sense, because if they were there, you'd all be gathering information at the same time.
Yeah. They're part of the operations when we're on a scene, so that's, are they part of our network? That
We're not really sure ready to take care of them.
But they're making the request after the fact. In your example.
Yeah.
Right, and I would say, if it doesn't fall under the exception, I would be reluctant to release it and just inform them that you're subject to HIPAA, and you're not allowed to under the HIPAA regulations. And if it push comes to shove, they can't get it some other way, they can always request a subpoena and then get the information that way.
And you could ask them too, whether, does this involve a crime, are you asking because this involves a crime? Just to make sure that you're not, upholding them, if they say yes in regards to that, then, you may have a reasonable basis to, under the crime exception, release it.
Something like a drunk driver, that would be a crime.
Right. Exactly. Or,
And-
maybe a bunch of things as far as the police department goes, reckless driving,
And it's important to remember when you do release information to law enforcement to only release, you follow the minimum necessary standard and only release the minimum amount that is needed.
The cops don't need to know his medical history.
No, not at all.
Name,
No.
date of birth, and
Yep.
All right, so the next area is whether you can share PHI with the patient's family and friends. So the answer sometimes is yes, if the individual is relevant to the patient's care or payment for care, and then there's a number of categories. The patient agrees, then certainly you can release it. The patient has been given the opportunity to prohibit or restrict the use, and they don't object. Or if you reasonably infer from the circumstances based on the exercise of professional judgment that the patient doesn't object to the disclosure. So they've kind of given a, sort of a catch-all, knowing that in your line of work, there are some situations where the patient can't, articulate agreement or maybe even articulate an objection. But by being with the people they're with and knowing these people are coming to the hospital with them and are going to continue to care for them, you know, that in the exercise of professional judgment, you believe that you can release the information to them.
And actually, it's important to remember, we changed this from the previous policy. So this has been revised. This is a new element that the Office of Civil Rights wanted to add to our policy. So it's important to remember that if the patient's there, you first ask for permission. And if the patient's unconscious, then of course you can follow your professional judgment. But OCR really wants you to make sure that you are going and specifically obtaining, you know, oral authorization before you proceed to share information.
And I think what was missing from the previous policy was that it just sort of had this judgment piece, and it didn't have sort of the first step of, you know, see if they will agree before you just rely on your professional judgment. Is that right?
Mm-hmm, that's right.
Now, they also do cover the situation where either the patient isn't present, maybe they've already been taken into the hospital, or they don't have the capacity, they're unconscious, or there's some sort of emergency that exists. And again, there, it gets down to whether you can share and discuss it with family, friends, or other individuals involved with the patient's care if you believe the disclosure is in the best interest of the patient. Again, so if you're at the hospital, for instance, the person has been rushed into surgery, the person they were with followed you to the hospital, and your understanding is they'll be there with the patient, certainly you think it's in the best interest of the patient for that person to understand what's going on.
That's the slide I had the question about with the patient not being present. That was the part when I first read it that didn't click for me.
And that's all I could think of exactly, as if, you know, in your situation, maybe they've already been removed from the ambulance by the time the family member gets there. Otherwise, yes, I'm not sure how the patient isn't present when you're providing care to the patient. Going over sort of patient signature requirements, it's my understanding that you have two different documents, and I think they're both on your electronic tablet. There's the Notice of Privacy Practices and the Patient Care Report. And again, that Patient Care Report is the piece that allows your billing company to bill the insurance. So that's the one we were talking about earlier. That's important to get the signature in the field if you can. And then you also want to get the signature on the Notice of Privacy Practices, again, assuming that the patient is alert and able to sign it. In regard to the Notice of Privacy Practices, that again is a requirement of HIPAA to have that brochure that explains to patients what their rights are under HIPAA. And so you want to furnish that pamphlet to the patient, and you want to obtain, again, have them sign it if it's a non-emergency situation. So both of these documents, there's kind of the emergency situation and the non-emergency situation. In regard to the Notice of Privacy Practices, you want to provide the brochure to them as soon as practical after the emergency, or give it to the hospital to give to the patient, and that's in regard to that brochure. If it's an emergency, you're not required to obtain their written acknowledgement. That's a specific HIPAA exception. Now again, for non-emergencies, that Notice of Privacy Practices, you want to provide it at or before the time of service if possible. If it's a non-emergency in your line of work, by its nature, everything is pretty much an emergency. And then you must acknowledgement, again, we talked about this, attempting to obtain that written acknowledgement in the non-emergency situations. And that's where the expert T-billing will follow up.
So like on a lift assist, we go over to a lift assist, we actually have to give them because we're not providing care so much, we're just lifting them up.
Well, that would be, you know, defined as providing a service, a healthcare service. So yep, you would have to give it. They don't have any exceptions for when you'd have to provide that notice to someone you're providing service to.
Other than someone you know has already received it, if I recall. To the pamphlet?
Is there an exception to that? Yeah, I don't think so. But I can double check on that too.
I talked about two signatures here on our patient care report. We only have them signed in one place. Now, I know you check two different things, but is that, I guess I'm kind of asking Tom too, is that, I mean, we give out this pamphlet, but they only sign one place.
There's a box where you highlight that you've given them the Notice of Privacy Practices.
Right.
And then there's the box where they sign off as the patient. So you click the one bullet, as I'm recalling image trend, you click the one bullet that says Doug gave you the pamphlet, and then the patient signs as, so that the patient, and you click the other one that says I authorize payment, authorize So by clicking those two bullets on the one signature, we've accomplished.
Okay, so there's only one place on your, in this.
There's one box that they sign in, but there's two little boxes that the paramedics will highlight.
Okay, so yeah, you really only have one
to
signature
document
then
the
that,
procedures.
I just want to make sure that we weren't missing something, because that's what.
Or if we needed a second signature box, is that something that we need?
no, it's like,
No.
Well, why did we create that written acknowledgement piece in the policy? Because you know, after the notice of privacy practices, we have that page where they're supposed to sign. Were you not using that previously? You've only been using the electronic one?
I don't remember.
There's the brochure, and then in the policy, there's a written acknowledgement.
Is that for employees, Andrea, though? Are you thinking of the employee one?
In our patient care report, there's, yeah, like he was saying, there's kind of two boxes that get checked. And one is related to the payment, one's related to the health information. And they both get checked in the patient sign.
So this is the image trend document.
This is the, and that's the page that I printed.
Oh, I thought you were doing a Red Wing document and an image trend. No, it's just
the
one.
I'm saying. So
Okay,
that
And that's
document I
fine.
sent to you as a print off of image trend.
okay, got it.
So-
Okay,
Yeah, so.
so that's fine.
So by clicking the appropriate bullets and having the patient sign, we cover our bases.
Yep,
Right.
yep, that's fine. There's been some confusion between us because we don't quite know what's on your template. So, all right, so I think we've probably covered this.
Okay, now I'm going to discuss patients' rights, which are contained in the Notice of Privacy Practices, and it's extensively contained in the policy, the revised policy that you will receive. And this really hasn't been changed, but I'm just going to review this with you. And first of all, patients have a right to inspect and copy their medical records. Should you receive a request for a copy of their records, or a person who would like to come in and review their records, please direct that to the privacy officer, who is Tom, and then he can follow through with it. And if you were to have any questions, please look at your policy. There's a long list of different rights they have. And also the fire department can deny a request for access to medical records if, for example, they don't have them, or if they don't have an authorization. Patients also have a right to amend their PHI. If you were to have a patient who said, no, I reviewed my ambulance report, I didn't break my right arm, I broke my left arm, and they want to have that amended, they have the right to do that. They have to submit a written document to the privacy officer, Tom, and then he will determine whether or not to grant or deny that request. He also can deny that request, and they can have a hearing, and there's a long process, which really doesn't involve most of you, but it's good to know should you receive that request. They also have a right to an accounting of the disclosures made by Red Wing Fire and Ambulance. An accounting of disclosures is a list of documents stating my ambulance report was submitted to so-and-so on such date, and also if you forwarded it to, let's say they were in a workers' comp injury, then it would also include, on so and such date, we provided a copy of the medical records to a certain individual. They are also entitled to request that Red Wing Fire and Ambulance restrict how health information about them is used or disclosed, and that's again up to the privacy officer, and there's again another appeal process if they disagree with that determination. They could submit compliments, complaints, and grievances, and those again should be directed to Tom. And then they also have the right to alternative communications. That would be if a person could not read, you may have the obligation to provide them an oral list of their rights. Or the next piece is safeguarding patient information.
And safeguarding patient information, what we're going to talk about again is some of your policy provisions and more in terms of how to protect patient information once you have it. The policy has designated Tom as the privacy officer, and on page 13 of your policy, when you receive it, you'll see there's a long list of duties that Tom has in light of HIPAA, mainly things like responding to some of the things that Andrea has listed, requests for information, making sure that training takes place, making sure that the policies are revised if there's been changes in the law, those type of things. The The policy does include a section on discipline in terms of if an employee impermissibly uses or discloses PHI, they may be subject to discipline. This is specifically included because it is a HIPAA requirement. And then there is information in the policy about role-based access. This is something that was added and refined in your policy. This is also a HIPAA requirement that sort of talks about how what access you have to PHI depends on what your role is in the organization. And so it lays out in the policy that certain information, supervisors have access to, PHI that they need in order to perform their jobs, to ensure quality assurance. Typically, paramedics only have access to PHI if they were on the ambulance run themselves. We have talked about some exceptions today. If other people in the organization need the information in order to perform their duties, then you're allowed to give that to them. But that's sort of what role-based access means. And the reason it's in there is because it is part of the HIPAA requirement. You'll also see a couple titles in the policy. Inspection specialist is one of them. And remind me, Tom, who the inspection specialist is.
Kevin.
So Kevin is the inspection specialist. Really, in the HIPAA policy, the duties sort of lie with if you ever have to use paper documents. For some reason your computer isn't working and you have to do a paper ambulance run. And Andrea can talk a little bit about that coming up in her next section. But just so you know who the people are, the training specialist. And so he'll have the fun job of providing HIPAA training in the future, perhaps, when taking care of HIPAA training responsibilities.
Okay, so now I'm going to go over a few other key provisions of the policy. And ambulance runs are submitted electronically to ImageTrend. And in the off chance the computers were down, you could not submit them to ImageTrend electronically, you would then complete a paper copy, and the carbon copy or yellow copy would go to Kevin, and then the original copy would be forwarded through the mail to ImageTrend. And HIPAA is very concerned with original paper documents, and electronic documents as well, but they want to make sure that all paper documents are in a secure area. They're not just laying around on a desk that someone could quick pick up. So in the event that you have a paper document that contains PHI, make sure you give it to Kevin and keep it safely guarded.
Can you have me go through the process on the paper ones real quick?
That's good, the old forms that we used to use. If the computer's down.
If the computer's down, we have to write a paper patient care report. What's the process for securing that information?
When they come back, they put it in the locked file cabinet in the back. I check those on a daily basis, and once everything's been submitted and completed, they get locked in the file cabinet in my office until that gets folded into the basement locked file cabinet.
So if we have to do a paper report, we bring the copy back and just put it in there with the rest of the.
Right, just like
put in a
do
lock.
it on the
Yep.
sheets and pieces.
So do we need to do an electronic one?
It still has to be submitted electronically later on when the computer's up and running.
What does?
Okay, also workstation use. Make sure you close doors at the end of your shift. This is all sort of common sense information, but HIPAA likes it in the policy, so we added these provisions. Make sure you log out of ImageTrend after a patient care report is posted. Safeguard access cards and ID badges. This is a secure building, so if you see someone wandering around, make sure you go talk to that person and make sure they have a reason to be here. And they should also be accompanied by an employee at all times. Next section is...
They came in the other day just to say hi, and I actually escorted him upstairs because of this. I mean, Larry's a former employee, you could, trust with anything in the world, but
Right.
and because it says so, we need to tighten up our ship, and
Right.
make sure that we're in compliance.
Oh, and another piece that OCR was concerned about was, let's say a fire, you're in the middle of submitting your patient care report, and the fire alarm goes off, and you need to go run to immediately go take care of that, and you don't have time to log off of ImageTrend. What should you do? They still would like you to log off of image trend. In the event that's not possible, at least turn off the monitor so it's not sitting open for a bystander to walk by and see. And if possible, let your superior know that you have this PHI sitting on a computer. And in the event you were to walk in the station, see a computer and a patient care report just sitting there, we would ask that it's not fun to go tattletale on your coworkers, but that could be a violation of HIPAA, and so go contact your supervisor and let them know that this is sitting there. There's also standard protocols that we added in light of HIPAA requirements. So these are questions you're supposed to ask yourself to make sure that a limited amount of PHI is used and disclosed. First question is PHI provided or received limited to what is actually necessary to accomplish the intended purpose? When completing PHI-related forms of documentation, is the information shared only with those who need it to accomplish the task? Is PHI discussed only when on duty or during designated training, or when you have a need to share that information with a person who may be treating another patient? Is PHI collected in a setting that provides reasonable privacy and protects the information from unauthorized disclosure? So, for example, you were sharing patient information with a nurse or a doctor. Try to use a lower tone of voice. Don't be shouting that out. And if there's other people standing around, try to go back in a corner so it's more secure. Make sure documents are kept confidential while in use. Don't be waving them around, passing them out, making copies. And then make sure that health records are stored in a secure time at all times. And then also make sure you log off of your computer and make sure your ambulance doors are locked.
And some of these may not always be practical, the locked ambulance doors. I mean, you want to be thinking of these sort of standard protocols and following them when you can, and you do have to use common sense at times. I mean, HIPAA does not want to get in the way of you providing appropriate, safe, timely care to your patients. So you have to use your common sense at times. But these are the protocols you should be thinking about, throughout your day.
I have heard that in the past that some of the HIPAA things are just kind of thrown out the window when a patient is deceased. Is that true, or?
No.
Okay. But like names and stuff like that should still not be released on deceased patients. Okay.
Right. And then original health records should only be removed pursuant to a subpoena, state statute, search warrant, or other court order. Should you receive a request for original health record, that should go to Tom, the privacy officer.
What about the privacy officer's absence? Can you delegate the duties?
Yes. Yep. So the next in line, which would be one of the fire captains, is that right? Okay.
And that's a good point. I mean, that's something that you should talk about internally so that if you are on vacation and something comes up, there's somebody who at least knows that I should be doing this and contacting Tom.
Mm-hmm. There's also a breach notification policy that's been added to the policy. And this was amended in 2008, but came into effect in 2009. And it requires like image trend and expert T billing, third parties who are accessing PHI, they can also be held accountable for violations of HIPAA now. So if you were to somehow discover that let's say you log into image trend and you're seeing other people's reports, or let's say you were to come across information that made you think that maybe someone was hacked into your computer or someone's hacked into image trend, those really need to be notified right away to Tom or his designee, because there are really severe civil penalties for breaches and violation if the department is not taking immediate steps to notify individuals of the breach. So let's say, for example, you were to come in and see that your computer was hacked into and you never notified Tom, and all of this PHI was disclosed over the internet. That would be really bad news for the fire department and could result in civil penalties up to $1.5 million. So if a breach is discovered, you must notify, well, actually, Tom would be in charge of sending out a letter to all patients notifying them of the breach. And then if it was a huge breach, let's say all patient care reports were released, then they may also need to notify media and the Department of Health and Human Services. Are there any questions on that new policy?
No, what if a laptop were to get stolen or lost? What would you do then?
That could constitute a breach of PHI. I actually talked to someone in the IT department, and yeah, Steve, and even though you are logging into ImageTrend, certain information is encrypted on that computer. So let's say, for example, someone stole your information and they were high tech, they would be able to somehow, I don't know how they obtain it, but some sort of computer lingo, they can use information to get that. So of course, if your computer's missing, notify Tom right away.
And we'd have to go through an analysis at that point, whether it meets this requirement of this new high-tech breach law, depending on what we found out from IT and so forth. But yeah, there are the importance of, notifying Tom is because this new high-tech policy reads in terms of the department has knowledge if one of its employees has knowledge. And thus, if an employee knew about a potential breach and didn't report it to the fire chief, the law would hold us accountable, and yet we may not know, or somebody in charge may not know and may not be able to take proper action. So yeah, it's a pretty significant amendment to the HIPAA.
It also goes with disposal of a computer when we take it out of service, because I think that kind of prompted our questions to Steve as far as, we just recently replaced one of our computers. And fortunately, we still have possession of it, and we can sweep it or clean it or do whatever needs to be done before we actually remove it.
Right.
Can't just be sent off to Joe Computer Guy as a donation.
Exactly. So I think that's it on our presentation. Are there any questions before we take the...
I know this is always a big one, but say we go to a multi-car accident or multi-patient car accident. We have limited staffing, limited vehicles. Now we're hauling 2 people from this car accident, 1 ambulance. Is that a violation of HIPAA? Because we're gaining information. They might not even be related or whatever.
No, and again, you have to go back to sort of common sense, and there is an exception in HIPAA for incidental disclosures, meaning if you're taking precautions to try to talk to, your coworker about what's going on, and the other person happens to hear because maybe they're still conscious. You have to be able to conduct your operations, and so, and they can't force you to have more vehicles than you can afford in your city. So you do what you can. You don't go over and talk to the other patient about, the other patient over here is right. I know. So that way they'll know, and you won't be able to, stop them from overhearing you. But you don't talk to the patient who's sitting up directly about what's going on with the other person unless you need to. And it may be in that situation too. They may be from separate cars, so they may not know each other at all, which would be your big HIPAA concern. But like I said, you can't. HIPAA can't hamstring, your operations to that extent.
Unless if they agree to disclose.
Well, and I'm saying
occasionally you'll get, how's the other guy?
Well,
And if the other guy agrees to disclose?
Yeah, then you could. And if they happen to be friends, they were in the same car accident, you might use your professional judgment to determine that that's okay, even if they didn't agree. But yeah, if the other guy is asking how the other guy is, you'd want to...
Transporting 2 people from different cars, and you're saying, I need to get his health history to help treat him. That's just an incidental. You don't need to worry exactly.
Right. Right.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Mr. Tom, you protected health information request from Fairview or St. Mary's. Do you want that to go through you now?
Yes. Unless I send it to a designee, but I've been handling all of them that have come through recently. What we're doing is we require an information disclosure request form anytime someone asks for any of our PHI. And so that gets completed. Because of what we know now about HIPAA, I scan those to my computer and then attach them to the patient care report as an attachment, so that 5 years from now, if John Smith asks for a disclosure of
Accounting of
accounting of
disclosures.
disclosure, I can pull up John Smith's report and say, yeah, we had 3 requests for your information. One was from you, one was from your attorney, and one was from so-and-so. And we got that information disclosure request form now attached to the patient care.
Does that still go through city clerk?
And they still go through the city clerk. The information disclosure request form comes to me. I print off the report, review it, bring it over to Kathy, the city clerk, who then verifies the person's identification before she distributes the information.
You know, one thing we should ensure too, Tom, is that Kathy has the updated policy as well, since she does play a little role
Yeah.
in terms of providing information.
Okay.
I had kind of a question, probably more for Tom too, but as far as, you talked about escorting people in the building, who needs to be escorted then at all times in the building?
I would say any non-employee.
So any city employee or anybody that doesn't have to do with ambulance operations or?
Yeah.
Or fire department? Yeah.
Well, I mean, let's use Kate Coleman as the example. She's got the pass card, she's got keys to the city as far as her ID badge. We have city council people, I think, have.
Electrician.
We have,
City council people have access to the
I
fire department?
believe they have their access code allows them into this facility.
Excellent.
So I mean, there's a large number of people, that, you know, called firefighters who don't do any patient care, but, you know, I mean, what's?
Do you have, I'm assuming those people aren't routinely in here walking around.
Well, there's,
Why not?
More than you would say, not routinely, but it does occur.
How much access to PHI would there be available to them to see if they were walking around unescorted?
I would say if people are logging off the computer after they post, and if you're following everything here, I would think that there'd be very little. But if you've got a patient care report up on your screen and walk away to go to the bathroom, and the mayor locked in because his passcode, his ID badge opens our door and happened to come to my office and see that patient care report, here we are.
Yeah, I would say the standard should be that anyone who comes to your department who's not an employee, and not an employee of this department, should be escorted. Because I don't know what, I don't think you want a lot of outside people walking around in your department. And frankly, I would question why all those people have access to your building.
So do we.
If, could I get your assistance in addressing that from a HIPAA legality standpoint?
I don't know, is that just been the way it's been? They've always had access and.
As far as I know, that's just the way it's been.
And why, and is there any reason you can think of they would need to have access?
Well, for example, Steve Hannis.
That I understand,
Comes over on a daily basis, because this is where his backup files are for the server.
Sure. And I can
He
see
could-
how
he could
your
just as easily
emergency
come
sort
to
of
the front door.
preparedness people might, okay.
He could just as easily come to the front door.
Or put his backup files over there where the stuff
They
is.
don't want
Has to be
to
offsite.
Offsite.
Oh, I see.
Where are the computers? Are they upstairs? That you,
We do them on
They're
that.
in the
oh,
EDA
laptops.
office.
Okay, so you just,
But you can remove them and bring them inside.
How would that pertain to our drugs that we keep on site?
to your drugs?
The ambulance service. They are not locked up.
HIPAA wouldn't.
HIPAA
No,
wouldn't,
I-
HIPAA
no,
wouldn't play
but-
into that because it doesn't have to do with information. But it does play into the people walking around the building.
How will we get held responsible for privacy?
So do people who have access, K, and can they get into the paper documents and the file cabinets, or are those?
No.
They'd have to bring.
Okay.
Yeah, they wouldn't have access to any of that.
And along with the laptops, they need to log in order to see any PHI?
Yes. They wouldn't, I would be shocked if they were able to log in because they're not.
Right.
They can
Recognize
connect
them.
them over here conversations would probably be the biggest one.
Okay, so I believe that Tom, you're going to collect these?
Yes.
Just to have proof that you took the test. But just
Actually,
correct.
Brian's gonna collect
Oh.
these, because he's our trainer.
Training
Oh,
specialist.
Brian is, okay. And then if you would correct your own answers, if you marked it wrong, just mark it wrong, and then on the top, you'll put your number correct. I feel like a teacher. Okay, number 1, who must follow the federal HIPAA regulations? D, all of the above. Physicians, healthcare providers, and Red Wing Fire and Ambulance. What does PHI mean? Protected health information, D. 3, except in the case of an emergency, which document needs to be provided to the patient? B, the Notice of Privacy Practices pamphlet. Number 4, your brother's best friend suffered a heart attack and was transferred to the hospital. Your brother is not involved in his best friend's medical care, but asks you about his condition. What should you do? Correct answer is C. Explain that it would be a violation of the patient's privacy for you to disclose PHI. And the reason why C is the answer is because he's not involved in his friend's medical care. 5, as your brother was playing basketball with his friends, his best friend suffered what he believes is a heart attack and collapses to the ground. Your brother calls 911 and you respond to the call. The patient is unconscious upon your arrival. Can you inform your brother of his best friend's condition? Answers? Yeah. What? The answer is D, you can, because he was there when his friend suffered the heart attack, so he has information that's relevant to the patient's care, and because he's unconscious, you cannot obtain his consent. So based on your professional judgment, you agree that you can share this information.
Now, if there's some reason in your professional judgment you think, they're not that close of friends and he wouldn't want him to know that, I mean, A is not an improper answer. I mean, certainly you're always safe if you don't tell someone something.
That's what I put A and B in. I mean, I would say no because, I mean, they're friends. They're still not. It's not a family member. He's not involved. Sure, he's going to be concerned,
But
You just call 911.
he's witness, yeah. So
But he
I figured it's because he witnessed it and he's the one that called 911, like he's kind of in on the care.
I infer the question asked, can you exchange information with your brother? And so that's why I put D.
yeah, and I think, I mean, and this is a good example of how, I mean, HIPAA doesn't address all of these situations, so you do have to use your professional judgment. But in our, we think you would be able to justify it if the person was there, they're very close friends, and he may be involved in follow-up care. I mean, maybe he's coming to the hospital with his friend. So that's why we said D.
Okay. Number 6, HIPAA prevents you from asking the friends who witnessed the heart attack about any allergies the patient may have. Yes, false. 7, a coworker is called away for a short errand and leaves the fire department logged into ImageTrend. You need to submit a report on the same computer. What should you do? We said A, and you might all not like us because of it, but technically it could have been a breach of HIPAA. And so, first of all, turn off that monitor to make sure no one else walking by would be able to see it, and then notify Tom just to be safe.
I'm not here, by your supervisor.
Right. Yep. Number 8, a 19-year-old female University of River Falls student is involved in a boating accident in Red Wing. She is in stable condition and awake and alert. Her father meets you as the ambulance arrives at the hospital and asks you for information on her condition. What is the best answer that you can do? C, yes. First ask the patient for permission, and then if she agrees, you can inform her father.
What if, okay, my question is, I know she's 19 years old and she's an adult, but what if her father's like, well, she's under my insurance? So it's
Right.
because she's still an adult that
Right.
she still can't release it.
Right.
Okay.
But if she was 16 and...
Even if he's paying for her insurance.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
even if they're underage, the way I understand it is parents can get information if they want from their kids. You can have
Well, because they're a minor.
right?
Only if they're emancipated.
Minor, yeah. If they're a minor,
Give us the definition of emancipated.
it's basically a minor would go to court and obtain a court order stating, I'm not under my parents' supervision, I'm illegal, technically an emancipated minor, so.
Yeah, or if they've had a child.
Right. Right, but if it's a 16-year-old with their, they don't want their dad to know they were messing around, if the father says they're under my insurance, you can tell them. You can tell the father, even though the kid's saying no, you can, because they're under 18.
I guess, maybe I was gonna say, I thought there was an exception in the HIPAA as far as if a person has to do with relating the payment of their.
Yep, you can.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying, this 19-year-old kid is under their dad's insurance. Can't we tell him about it because he's the one that's footing the bill?
No, because they're 19, they can disagree. If they're await and alert, say if they were not, then.
Well, yeah, then your best judgment. Okay. I was just curious.
Okay, number 9, a news reporter meets you at the hospital and informs you that the boating accident in which the 19-year-old female student was injured was caused by a drunk driver. The reporter is doing a story for the nightly news. She asks you for the patient's name and condition. You can provide the reporter with this information. False.
Well, doesn't that actually violate freedom of information acts,
No, because HIPAA prohibits you from doing it.
In HIPAA, in the sort of grand scheme of the law, the more specific law always trumps sort of general laws. So because HIPAA is very specific as to what healthcare providers can disclose and cannot disclose, HIPAA would always, govern what you can disclose. Even though there might be a more general, public data law, I mean, there might be a means for them to obtain that information, but not from this department.
Okay, number 10, you can discuss PHI with a patient's family member, friend, or close family friend relevant to the person's involvement in the care or payment for care if F, all of the above. The patient agrees, the patient has been provided the opportunity to reject the disclosure but does not object, and based on the exercise of professional judgment, you infer that the patient does not object to the disclosure. Number 11, due to the HITECH Act, PHI can no longer be shared with supervisors. True or false? It's false, yeah. The HITECH Act is that breach notification policy, basically. Number 12, the minimum necessary standard does not need to be used for treatment purposes. That's true. You can freely share PHI to help treat the patient. Number 13, the minimum necessary standard does not need to be used when releasing PHI to law enforcement. False, yes. 14, if a patient requests an amendment to their PHI, the request must be honored. That is false because there could be a disagreement between the patient and the department, and it really goes to Tom and the department's decision is if they believe the report's accurate, they can deny that request.
Even if they said, like, I hurt my right wrist, really?
Well, if you, I mean, it depends. If the department thinks,
I
know it was the left wrist because the paramedic on duty is confident, is sure it was the left wrist. I mean, this is unlikely to come up in that type of situation. It's more likely that, I've had it in the school context where years later they say, well, I never told the doctor that, and they want me now to believe that, this is false in their medical record. Typically, it's because they've just, decided, gee, that wasn't really in my interest to disclose that to the person, and they want you to take it out. And you say, if you're confident the person said that, no, I'm not going to take it out because that's what was told to me on that day. You may now have later changed your mind about it, but.
Someone says I got this seat, something or other, and we're later on down the line, they say, don't really want to have that, I want to have that in the record, they can say, I changed my mind, I don't want it in there, but we don't have to grant that.
Exactly.
Alcohol use might be one of the most common ones for us.
Yeah, all their drug use.
They were using drugs or alcohol, and then we back said, no,
Tom, do you get requests to amend records? I mean, I would think this would be very rare.
Yeah.
But just so you know, it's not, just because the patient says, I want something changed, doesn't mean they have the right to ask, but they don't have the, mandatory right to have that request granted.
We have instances where people might dispute, well, you didn't give me oxygen, or whatever, those sorts of things. We never had a formal request to amend.
Okay.
There's a formal procedure too. They have a document containing certain information, and it's all in your policy. Number 15, patients must always be shown a copy of the Notice of Privacy Practices. It's false. It's a little tricky, but you know, in an emergency, if they're unconscious, then you leave it at the.
That's true. They are going to get it through the hospital.
They're going to get it, but they're not
so-
being shown it.
If they can't be handed it, you're supposed to leave it with their personal
Right,
belongings. or have it.
right. So, you know, you could say that was sort of unfair, that question that Andrea wrote.
There's always one that's unfair.
Okay, and then 16, Red Wing Fire and Ambulance must disclose PHI to law enforcement upon their request. False.
Well, thank you all for your time. We've really appreciated it, and
Thank you.
nice being here.